Today's scenario is one that I've covered before, but I think it was one of my worst scenarios. Today, we're going to do it again, and it will be quite significantly different from the previous one. Two scenarios will be covered today. One where France achieves a moderate victory, and one where we explore a France which achieves all of their goals in this war. Both obviously changing history in some quite extreme manners from the grand British victory of our timeline. So let's first explore what the French plans were during the war. Their main plan, correctly, realized that the British would have naval supremacy, giving them the edge on the colonial front. To compensate for this, the idea was that surely France, Austria and Russia together could achieve total European supremacy. Importantly, by capturing British Hanover and defeating Prussia too. On the colonial front then, the goal was simply to not allow for a full British victory. The hope was that the colonies could hold out for long enough and the war would become expensive enough that France could trade back Hanover in exchange for colonial gains. So, what went wrong with this plan? Well, initially, not too much. The colonies did indeed hold out for years against the British, yet surprisingly, it was in Europe where they ran into issues. While minor victories were made, the coalition of France, Russia and Austria failed to pacify Hanover and Prussia. France had launched a large invasion of Hanover, yet got pushed back by the British and Prussians. While this was going on, the British would eventually begin achieving not just colonial, but importantly also naval victories. Due to these, pressure began to mount for France, as it became clear that the colonies will soon fully collapse. Now, as a backup plan, France did have some vague hopes of invading Britain or Ireland, which we will explore later, but especially after the naval defeats, this became completely impossible. Now, while this was occurring, the Prussians were beginning to come under increasing pressure, and the idea that Prussia may just fully collapse wasn't crazy towards the end of the war. Still though, even if Prussia and Hanover fell at this point of the war, Britain had won the continental conflict, and Hanover wouldn't be enough to trade for all of North America. Not to mention that Prussia didn't surrender. Instead, Tsar Elizabeth of Russia died, and Peter III, her successor, was a major fan of Prussia, and immediately pulled his nation from the conflict, and it was even feared that they may switch sides fully. In light of this fear, Sweden also left the conflict, allowing Prussia to bounce back fully. Combine this with a failed Franco-Spanish invasion of Portugal, and now France has truly lost on every theater. And while basically nothing changed on the European map, Britain would achieve continental supremacy in North America, and in India too, the French would be kicked out, as the foundation was laid for the rise of Britain in India. Britain had basically achieved the most complete victory, and was well on the way to world hegemony. So, my suggestion for a French victory is a far shorter war, where France's plan for the war were basically successful. The conflict would begin with some minor British-French conflicts over North America, just like in our timeline, and then Prussia preemptively invades Saxony. The coalition against them forms, and pressure is being put on them. Now, most importantly, the French invasion of Hanover must be successful, while Prussia is put on the back foot a little bit earlier. With this already difficult position for Britain, I will turn my attention to Spain. It would be perfect if Spain now entered the war as well, opening up even more front lines for the British to worry about. This can be done by letting Ferdinand VI, who was in favor of neutrality, die a bit earlier, being replaced by Charles III, who was very much in favor of entering the war. If we assume that the Spanish invasion of Portugal achieves at least some successes, that's yet more pressure being put on Britain. During this time, much like in our own timeline, the North American front mostly keeps stable, though the British do achieve some big victories, like capturing Havana in Cuba. The war is by no means completely lost for Britain, but their losses and the fact that a Franco-Spanish army very much can start to threaten a naval invasion should things continue to deteriorate, makes a choice in London to negotiate an end to the war rather easy, essentially abandoning their ally of Prussia to the whims of the remaining coalition. With the war now over, what might a peace deal look like? Well, first, Silesia is returned to the Austrians, which is already a devastating blow. But much of Pomerania too is lost to the Swedes, and perhaps most humiliatingly of all, the Prussians lose Prussia to the Russians. Any dreams of Prussia becoming a great power are squashed. The North American peace deal then is rather mild. I imagine some border corrections in both directions would occur, but the French don't dismantle the British Empire in any way. Over in India, quite early in the war, Bengal had been captured by the British, and I don't see France being able to force them out even with the war over. Still, while Britain is comfortable in the north, France retains their position in the south, and both powers can now start competing in a devastating scramble for India. With that, the war is over, and you may think, hey, Britain barely lost anything. In this, you would be very correct. In fact, due to gaining Bengal, they may have actually become more powerful as a result of the war. Fact is though, Britain has the naval edge and they know it. Should France have continued the war after Prussia's collapse, occupying Hanover, Britain would just continue their naval strategy, and at the very least, ensure that France suffers some significant defeats in the colonial game. No, a compromise peace deal, much like this one, was exactly what the French were hoping for. Their North American empire was secure, their future in India was intact, and they have the time to start building up their navy even more. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, an interesting point that we must discuss before continuing are the terms of the Franco-Austrian alliance. In exchange for France helping reclaim Silesia, the French were supposed to get the southern lowlands, and the Austrians would get compensated with Parma in Italy as well. Should this happen, it would be a major upset for French power in Western Europe. Yet, I must say that I am not fully convinced that Austria would follow through on their promise. It would be a major concession to the French, and with Prussia now out of the running again, it is very much not unthinkable that France and Austria are preparing to become enemies again. I think it's almost guaranteed that Austria at least attempts to get out of the agreement, especially if they get Britain to back them over the issue. Concretely though, I don't have any evidence one way or the other, so we will follow the timeline where the original agreement is upheld. Just know, there are also several timelines where this doesn't take place, though it might very well require Britain and Austria to restart another war immediately, which they might not be interested in. Besides that, it's not actually that terrible of a concession for Austria. They are now a far more concentrated power in northern Italy and Germany. All the lowlands does for Austria is ensure future conflicts with France, where Austria would be on the front lines. The disconnected territories are difficult to defend and offer little for the rest of the empire. Especially if Austria hopes to maintain the alliance with France, this concession would ensure that Austria has a role to play in a French-dominated world order. Anyways, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We have another border change to sort out. As you may have noticed, Russia now controls Prussia. They very likely don't keep this, as they planned to return it to the Poles in exchange for the Duchy of Courland and potentially some other Baltic territories. With this, the real post-war map is done. We have a destroyed Prussia, a powerful Austria, and the two great powers of France and Britain continuing their war for domination. Now, let's zoom around the world a bit. North America has basically returned to their pre-war status quo, but the French position is far from safe. The British colonists outnumber the French by about 20 to 1. North America continues to be a neat little revenue source for France, yet it is also very much a secondary theater. From the British perspective though, the 13 colonies, rebellious as they were in our timeline, remain far more loyal to the British. As the French remain on the borders of the colonies, going independent could very swiftly degrade into French domination instead. The fear of the French Catholics might keep the colonists with Britain for protection for longer. India then is far more interesting now, as France continues in the south while Britain is present in Bengal. As both sides are exhausted from direct wars with each other, India becomes the main sphere that the two do combat in. Britain has the military and especially naval edge on the continent, but France is still very much a worthy opponent in the diplomatic race for dominance. This is impossible to map for certain, but Britain likely establishes themselves in the northeast, while the French focus on consolidating the south. A full war would be required to sort out the master of the continent, but for now, the two giants continue to gobble up more and more. If, much like in our timeline, the Marathas start to decentralize yet further, even more of India would be opened up to the French and British thirst for power. Anyways, let's go back to North America. The natives have benefited quite a lot from this new arrangement. Like I alluded to before, the French didn't really move to North America in massive amounts like the British did. Therefore, the natives continue to be key for French colony on the continent, as without their support, the territory is very vulnerable to British invasion. The French alliances with the natives, which undoubtedly includes encouraging raids into British territory, further brings the colonists back to Britain. That being said, we need to return to the British themselves. Much like in our timeline, this war would have been extremely costly for Britain. Unlike our timeline though, Britain hasn't monopolized Indian trade and hasn't monopolized North America. Despite the war being shorter, Britain's economic situation might even be worse. While at peace, the threat of France on Britain continues to be far greater. The French Navy hasn't gotten humbled, and the gain of Belgium represents the continued fear of an invasion of the British Isles. These factors would absolutely still lead to Britain increasing the taxes on the colonies. Here, we might have another split in the timeline. While I've discussed before the various factors that might lead to a more loyal colony, unrest over these taxes would still rise significantly. While it's far from guaranteed, if Britain doesn't seriously negotiate for more colonial autonomy, an American revolution is definitely not impossible. Now imagine that this Britain also loses their American colonies, essentially removing Britain from North America entirely. This would be a loss I very much doubt that they would ever be able to recover from. For now though, I will leave this subject up in the air. Do you think America would still try to declare independence, or would they stick with Britain, potentially as a more autonomous dominion of the crown? Moving on to another subject, we have France. Colonial spoils from North America and India do a lot to improve their long-term economic stability. And even if an American revolution breaks out, France has no reason to bankrupt themselves in order to get revenge on Britain. Assuming that they avoid hypothetical other costly wars, this consolidated France could become a true beast. As long as the French keep their treasury at least okay, it doesn't have to be great, just okay, their short-term stability could be ensured. The 7 Years' War was costly, but afterwards, France was slowly paying down their debt. It was the American War for Independence that doubled France's already big debt that really broke the treasury. You know where I'm going with this? The French Revolution, as we know it, is quite possibly gone. This changes quite literally everything, and it will make the 1800s a weird mix of our timeline's economic and political developments, yet with the traditional early modern geopolitics. Assuming no new, decisive war is started or won by either of these great powers, their competition remains the driving force of much of the geopolitics of the era. Yet now, the Franco-British rivalry is fought in the context of trains, increasing industrialization, the modernization of naval warfare, the development of a new capitalist upper class, and all sorts of other upheavals. The great luck that Britain had in our timeline was that right before industrialization and what I would call the modern day, they had defeated their main rival France twice over. First in the 7 Years' War and then under Napoleon. By the time Napoleon was defeated, Britain was left the only serious colonial power. And this head start, none of the other powers would ever be able to make up. The fact that France is, and remains, a significant rival is the single biggest difference of this timeline. Yet, all of this does depend on a single factor. Does France get with the times? Absolutism and industrialization do not often go hand in hand, as the new elites, developing from new money, clash with the old nobility, and before long they start demanding pesky things like influence and power. Should France remain stuck in their aristocratic ways, which could even mean a sheer lack of industrialization, they will get eclipsed by Britain, who will inevitably rock up with a fleet of newly built ironclads and wipe the floor with the outdated Frenchies. Now, if France does industrialize, yet completely refuses to modernize their political regime, that is also the perfect recipe for future internal troubles. Not necessarily on the scale of the French Revolution, but very possibly enough for the meritocratic British to seriously threaten the French again. Of course, even if such a scenario occurs and Britain manages to become the global hegemon, seizing most of the French colonies, it should be clear that this would happen at least 50 years later. The entire world as we know it would be completely unrecognizable, as grand revolutions like the American and the French ones have never happened, and Napoleon wouldn't be there to spread those ideals further. But of course, that is assuming that France doesn't modernize. If France does, they have about twice the population of Britain in Europe. Even if Britain is twice as industrialized as France, France would still be able to compete. And that's not even taking into account their allies like Bourbon Spain, who would still control most of the Americas, at least for now. Now, there are a bunch of other aspects of the scenario that I would like to explore away from Britain and France. Yet I feel like there is a perfect opportunity to discuss them in another video, as this one is becoming quite long. For the most part, there is a clear west to east split in Europe in this timeline. With France and Britain focused in competition with each other, Eastern Europe is off doing their own thing completely. All significantly impacted by the fact that Prussia is gone. So I have the perfect suggestion for a part 2 to this video, releasing this Tuesday. What if we go back to the war itself and have Tsarina Elizabeth live for just a little bit longer, allowing the Prussians to fight until the bitter end. The beauty of this timeline is that while Hanover might fall, Britain had essentially already won the war in the colonies. What this means is that we can expect a scenario where the French and the British are mostly unchanged from our timeline, but Prussia is still gone. This way, we can explore the changes to Eastern Europe independently without them getting overshadowed by the big two. So, if you're interested, subscribe for that. Still, this video is not quite done, as I want to explore an extreme French victory. While winning the Continental War was indeed a major aspect of French policy, we did also discuss some more extreme plans, those including a naval invasion of Britain. This could potentially come coupled with a restoration of the Catholic Stuart dynasty to the British throne. But if this was deemed unprofitable for France, just militarily occupying Britain would be pretty great too. Both of these scenarios we will cover in the remainder of this video. So, what would need to change for either of these to happen? A French naval victory, of course, and a big one. Obviously, this is easier said than done, and would require some serious incompetency from Britain. Considering how unlikely this was, we don't have to spend too much time on this setup. Now, while we could relatively realistically get a moderate French force onto Scotland or Ireland, such a smaller force would likely just be pushed back into the sea, at great cost to both Britain and France. We need a bigger force, so let's just say that France and Spain managed to combine their navies and launch a three-pronged invasion of England, Scotland and Ireland. Now, even with a successful landing, their success is not guaranteed, but it's not unthinkable either. Britain had left the home islands severely underdefended, assuming that the Royal Navy would keep them safe. Assuming a large enough French force lands on the British Islands, their success would be safe to bet on. With London under French control, let's first discuss the scenario where the Stuarts are not returned to the throne. In such a timeline, the French have achieved complete dominance over Europe, and the peace they will impose on Britain will make the French defeat seem mild. Almost certainly, Ireland will be split from Britain, devastating for British control over the Atlantic, and yet another position that France can threaten invasion from. It is possible, but in my opinion unlikely, that Scotland would also be stripped away. Should this happen, that would be a true checkmate to English power, as the French would have little issue marching to London again and again. On the North American front then, the French resolve all border conflicts in their favor while seizing Canada for themselves. Britain would be left with the 13 colonies, as their population is just too much for France to control. British holdings in the Caribbean would also suffer a crippling blow. Finally, in India, British Bengal is seized by the French, putting them in a terrifyingly good position on the Indian subcontinent as well. Britain would be allowed to keep Hanover on the European continent, as it is still the perfect territory to seize and bully the British with in the future. The war was now over, and the French victory could not have been more decisive. Britain would never be able to recover from such a defeat. In the years following, France would invest heavily in their navy, and Britain just doesn't have the means to keep up. The Royal Navy, while still impressive, could no longer reliably defend against French attacks from all sides. The remaining colonies in America are little good, as Britain needs to put effort into defending them from France, yet they get upset when you suggest that they pay some taxes. Quite possibly, the colonies grow more autonomous, as Britain stops defending them, but in exchange also stops taxing them. A return to India might be somewhat possible from the west, but competing with French dominance overall would be a pipe dream. It seems now clearer than ever. The 1800s will be the French century. Britain is not a threat, Prussia is destroyed, Spain is a Bourbon ally, and Belgium would still pass to France due to the agreement with Austria. By this point, Austria is the only one that might stand up to France, and let's be honest, they couldn't on their own. I don't have to get into much detail, but I think we all realize that the future looks very, very French. Moving back then, the timeline where the Stuarts are installed in power is arguably worse than Britain. No, actually, it almost certainly is. Basically, nobody would cheer for the return of the Stuarts, apart from portions of the Catholic minority. Everyone would see the new king for what he was, a French puppet. Interestingly, the Hanoverians would be allowed to continue to rule in Hanover, a fact we might return to later. Territorially speaking, the peace would be far more lenient on Britain. Again, mostly restricted to minor territorial changes. Politically though, the British are shot. You can expect coups or a major civil war within a decade or so, devastating the home islands yet further, potentially escalating with things like Irish rebellions. Over in the colonies, imagine how they'd react to being ruled by a Catholic French puppet. Loyalists, restorationists, and independence fighters begin to vie for control over the 13 colonies. For France, I don't think it's unthinkable that these wars become something akin to the American Revolutionary Wars, as they spend millions on attempting to keep the Stuarts in power in Britain. Here, the scenario splits again. It is possible that France wins this conflict, and the Stuarts consolidate power with the help of France. Once again, if true, this scenario is amazing for France, as they still control the most powerful nation in the world, with Spain and Britain as loose allies. Much like in the last scenario, who is really left to contest French hegemony over Europe, or indeed beyond? Once more, Austria is left as the only real rival to French hegemony, but even if Spain, Britain and Austria all ally to fight the French together, I might put my money on the French in this timeline, depending on what the Russians do. Now going back again though, another interesting, albeit somewhat unrealistic option is that the French continue to struggle with the British Civil War, which is now the war that exhausts the French treasury. Both the North American and the British theaters just drag and drag, as despite French military supremacy, basically everyone in England continued to oppose French domination. Eventually, the pro-Hanover party kicks the French out again, but Britain is completely exhausted and devastated, in no position to call itself a world power in the short term. More importantly though, we now have the conditions for a French Revolution anyways, which opens the door to a bunch of wild timelines. If the revolution is anything like in our timeline, it will already very much shake up Europe, though it would be difficult to go into specifics. For that reason, despite it being far from guaranteed, let's place Napoleon in control over this alternate France. Can you imagine? A Napoleon in control over France while there is no Britain to resist him. In fact, one of the first things he might do is invade Britain again, installing a republic, removing both the Stuarts and Hanoverians from power, both of whom he'd blame for Britain's current hardships. With Britain under his control and the might of a major colonial empire under his thumb, there is quite literally nothing that can be done to stop Napoleon. Without Britain as the unifying subsidiary of anti-French coalitions, far fewer wars would be needed to basically confirm Napoleon's domination over Europe, through puppets and allies. Sure, he would still face some issues, like a Spanish guerrilla war, but without Britain to back them, and no other nations to take advantage of French weakness, the French have achieved the most total domination I have ever given them in any timeline. Is it likely that this would have happened? No. But is it unthinkable? Also, absolutely not. But even if we assume that the French Revolution happens, but Napoleon doesn't rise out of it, should this revolutionary France ever settle into a solid regime, they are still in control over one of the most powerful European states, a significant part of India, a very decent North American empire, and, once again, their main rival of Britain remains crippled. Even without a Napoleon, the future for revolutionary France looks very, very bright. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series, and if you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom one is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.